It may not be obvious to people who are not regular political consumers just how much Trump lies. Take one example. The MAGA abortion crackdown, which so many people are living through, is widely opposed around the nation. It's unpopular, including in conservative states. At the last debate, Trump went out claiming how it was actually really popular. And some people could be tricked or confused by that, especially if they don't have personal experience in that. And that's just an example of something he does where then the candidate responding has to decide how much do you fact check that with your answer and rebut that and reframe that and make sure people understand it's not even a red-blue thing. Kansas didn't like his abortion policy. Florida has actually got a plan to try to maybe overthrow some of it legally. But that's why so many candidates, including Republicans, have found Trump is hard to debate. Now, Harris, for her part, has shown an assertive style, including on these kind of issues and truth and lies, when she was in debates and running against the Trump-Pence ticket last cycle.
Donald Trump, on the other hand, has been about covering up everything.
Thanks. We're about freedom and respecting the freedom of the American people.
Let's talk about respecting the American people. You respect the American people when you tell them the truth. I think this is supposed to be a debate based on fact and truth. Donald Trump doesn't understand that because he doesn't understand what it means to be honest.
Honesty, facts, truth. Truth not only as a democratic value, if you want to be high-minded, that we can debate the size of the government or the size of immigration flows or how much money we should spend on this or that, but we would have to be telling the truth about how much money. What's the point of debating it if the numbers are made up? That's sort of the active kind of obvious reason why you have truth if you're debating something. But she also went further there, and we may see that as a preview for what she does tomorrow night, trying to make sure the public understands that if the other side, as she argues it, Trump and Pence, lie about everything, then they don't respect you, that this is an affront, trying to put what we might call a larger organizing structure around it. So it's not just politicians snapping at each other about each individual claim or lie, but a larger point. And to land that, she has to find ways to prove it so that people with their own eyes and ears, even if they're not super political, even if they still have questions about her, even if they haven't decided who they're voting for, start to get the sense over this hour plus, one person might be lying more, and that person doesn't respect you, as she put it. How are you going to give them power if you can't believe what they say? Now, Donald Trump has done 6 general election debates. Harris has done 1 with Pence that I just showed you. So she is trying to prep up and catch up in a way. The reporting shows they have a mock stage. They have a Trump stand-in who's unleashing the kind of harsh attacks and offensive comments that could throw even a seasoned and tough politician off their game if they're not used to it and prepped for it, like practicing anything else. Trump, for his part, is, quote, practicing how to respond to his expected barrage of attacks on his character, the Post reports. Now, usually campaigns slow down a bit right now in this week. Of course, the Harris campaign started later than ever because of the shift that we all know about. And because also there's a sign that this is a really tight race, Harris is still pushing all kinds of themes new this week in addition to prepping for the debate. They got that Dick Cheney endorsement last week. Now they're using their cash edge to run these new ads, I'll show you briefly, about Donald Trump and how he can't even keep the confidence of his own aides who've seen him up close and in private doing the work. I should tell you, these are running on Fox News with Trump officials criticizing Trump. And they also, we know, are airing this locally in the Mar-a-Lago media market so that Donald Trump himself might catch it live.
Here's his vice president.
Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States.
His defense secretary.
Do you think Trump can be trusted with the nation's secrets ever again?
No.
His national security advisor.
Donald Trump will cause a lot of damage.
Take it from the people who knew him best. Donald Trump is a danger to our troops and our democracy.
Pretty striking. And that comes again after Dick Cheney himself endorsed Harris. I want to be clear. What you're seeing here in the politics of national security and these Republicans and hawks is extraordinary. In the traditional sense of the word, extraordinary. Not ordinary, unusual, striking. And because we live through these times, I've talked to you about this before, where a lot of extraordinary, unusual things happen. Sometimes you say, well, it can't all be unusual, right? But This Cheney swing of both family members was unimaginable just 8 years ago when Dick Cheney was endorsing Donald Trump. This shift of these national security experts, high-level Republicans, lifelong Republicans, hawks, saying, we've seen Donald Trump. Our number one issue is national security, and you can't give him power again because it would be dangerous to this country. That's some mood music going into this big debate. And Donald Trump's response is important because sometimes you see him adjust. I've told you, this caricature of him as a bumbling, quote-unquote, angry idiot, end quote. It's not only, you could say, unfair, it's not true. Sometimes he has a keen sense of things, like I've told you, he's been changing his position or claiming he has different positions on abortion because he sees his positions unpopular. He's been running from Project 2025 because he sees it's toxic in states that matter. But on these national security issues, Donald Trump is not adjusting. He is not tacking to the center, and he's not responding to the substance of those serious people, including Dick Cheney, that I just showed you. What Donald Trump was doing over the weekend, and there is a reason I'm showing you this, we don't just show you anything and we don't just regurgitate lies around here, but this is important to fact check and show you. Donald Trump is vowing what sounds like deliberately violent or illegal border policies. Before I show you what he says, I'm going to put this law, as you see, I'm going to leave this on the screen for a moment because U.S. law enforcement are not supposed to escalate encounters, let alone aim for bloody border patrol. Indeed, under law, using deadly force is illegal unless an officer faces an individually grave, measurable risk of harm. Those rules bind all U.S. law enforcement, including Border Patrol. And that brings me to what Trump is now vowing over the weekend. And this should be known so you understand what we get from Trump tomorrow night at the debate might not be this extreme. He might even run right away from this. But to his base, with that programming, he is campaigning on what he says he will do, that he will order officials to go past what I just showed you the law is, that he will do, quote, bloody border enforcement, that he will have people, quote, killed immediately for returning to the U.S. border.
Getting them out will be a bloody story. Should have never been allowed to come into our country. If you come back, you will be executed. You will be killed immediately. Not going to be easy, but we'll do it.
That's what he's running on in public, even as he might run away from it because he has some political and PR instincts tomorrow night. Fact check. What you just heard him say, the former president, current Republican nominee, is requesting an illegal order. So those are the kind of orders that, if issued, are still immediately illegal. There is no immediate kill policy allowed. U.S. officials take an oath to the Constitution, not to any president, even Donald Trump and whatever he thinks he can order, even if he's reelected. U.S. officials would have an obligation to resist that kind of unlawful order. And separately, groups might sue to try to get a court injunction preventing anyone from just doing immediate executions on the border. And this is not just me as a lawyer turned news anchor reminding you of some technicalities. We have precedents. Judges swiftly halted Trump's immigration bans because they were found to be likely to be unlawful. So they were halted pending further court review, which means even though he said do it, everyone who follows the Constitution, people in law enforcement, DHS, said no. And by the way, that travel ban did not involve something as extreme as people being, quote, killed immediately, end quote. But it was still halted. At the same rally, I want you to know that Donald Trump made the authoritarian claim, quote, this might be our last election. And over the weekend, he posted lies about the election and made a vow to jail lawyers, operatives, donors, and, quote, illegal voters, basically who cross him. That's drawn condemnation from election officials, many noting that such rhetoric could provoke violence. Could provoke violence is a careful sentence, but basically an understatement. It's not just a risk of what could happen that may or may not happen. It's the logical outcome and thus likely foreseeable intent of the same person who fanned the flames of the last insurrection with the big lie, which led to the violent storming of the Capitol, an attempted coup, and many people, including Trump supporters, sitting in prison right now over that. There is a real link from Trump's lies to the damage that Harris aims to address in real time when this really goes down tomorrow night. while she also has to do the balance of advocating her vision and not getting completely buried in responding to Trump, which is the debate balance I mentioned earlier in this breakdown. And that's, again, not a blue or red thing, not a Democrat or Republican thing. If you're old enough to remember those early Republican debates, that balance, how much do you respond to him without looking like all of your time in the debate is about him, which in a weird way makes him larger even if it criticizes him, that balance has confounded Republicans who thought they could stop him when he first appeared and who initially dismissed his type of lies and bluster and debate performances as a kind of flash in the pan back in the day. And remember, if you're getting ready for tomorrow night and going, oh, Donald Trump's going to blow it, Democrats also had to witness how Trump managed to strike a less voluble mode that worked strategically during President Biden's clearly wobbly debate performance this summer. And I got to tell you, this is true in the courtroom or in a debate. It is a mark of skill, if you are already winning, to know when to drop back or calm down because you don't need to say more. The other side is helping you win. Harris's team knows all this, best we can tell. And they also know one reason they are currently doing better in the state polls that matter than the same Democratic ticket seemed to be doing a few months ago when she was the running mate and not the nominee. Right now, I'm going to do what I do around here sometimes, tell you something you already know. The Harris campaign sees that Democrats and her side are more excited than they were a few months ago because they have something affirmative. Her energy, her positivity, the idea of turning the page with a new leader for the country. And that is different than just warning about the very real dangers of more Trumpism, which I just showed you with facts, is out there this weekend and cannot be ignored either.